Welcome to this edition of the His Show podcast, Sunday 15. This is Lincoln Lawing coming at you with my main man, Austin Robinson. Austin, what's been going on, man? How you been?
Been good, man. Been busy. I know it's been a while since we've been together, but looking forward to getting back on it.
I'm glad to have you back in the recording booth with us. Y'all cranking up baseball season, had a scrimmage last weekend, got another one coming up. How things looking? How's coaching going this year?
It's fun so far. We got a really young team. We only got one senior, so expectations are kind of up in the air right now. We don't really know what we're going to have, but we've got a very talented young group of freshmen and sophomores, and we're looking forward to seeing what they bring to the program as we kick off the season next week officially.
Well, good stuff. You know what I've always thought is, you think baseball is a hot weather sport, you think football is a cold weather sport, but most high school level, actually, football is played in scorching heat, and most high school baseball is played in the cold and the wind. You ever notice that?
Oh yeah, those first 2 weeks of the season, early March, when the wind and the cold mix like that, it's pretty brutal out there.
It is not a time to take one off the handle for sure. But today for our Sunday 15, we're going to be coming at you with Remain, Retreat, Rise Up. That will make sense as we get going. But what we got here is our first verse is Galatians 6:9. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. So once again, Galatians 6:9. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. So what I want to talk about today is how we all experience seasons of frustration in life. You know, sometimes it seems that adversity is around every corner. As we pursue what God's called us to, there's adversity and adversity everywhere we go. Other times we experience success, and it seems like victory is around every corner. There's also times when there's like no success or no victory. It's just kind of like simple perseverance in the day-to-day that gets us to the next stopping point. You know, kind of like Austin in preseason or when it's cold outside, just kind of grinding away. You know, you hadn't played any games yet, but you're just kind of grinding away, practicing. So I've just seen in Scripture and in my own life that there are three ways to respond when things get difficult. We can retreat, we can remain, or we can rise up. And all three of these are appropriate responses. It just depends on the season and situation that we face. Just like we talked about last week with our pushing and praying. It's same God, could be a different season, different place that we're in, and just figuring out what that's looking like. But it can be complicated to understand when to do what. But sometimes it's like, hey, what way do I go? I just wish God would just appear in the clouds and tell me what to do. But if we follow God closely, we'll see the path that he's called us to. So we're just going to dig into a couple of these, what these mean. So the first one is when you come up on a situation, remain. So what that means is keep doing what you've been doing because that's what you should be doing, and that's the path to success. Because if God is in it and he's called you to it, you can trust his process. And the Israelites learned this as they circled Jericho for 7 days before the walls fell, and this requires patience. You know, Austin, it's like God told them when they were taking Jericho, circle the city for 6 days, and on the seventh, the wall will fail. Well, day 3 or 4, maybe they doubted a little bit. Maybe they started thinking like, hey, is this really what we're supposed to be doing? But it was. So it was a situation where it's like, hey, don't need to quit. Don't need to do anything different. I just need to stay the course, do what God's called me to do, and stay in the mundane and keep doing it. And also with the Israelites, they talked about how, you know, when they were following God through the wilderness, that when the cloud would move, they would move. And he said when the cloud stopped, they would remain. So it's just a good reminder that sometimes we need to remain where God is, remain doing what he's called us to, and continue to go down that road. So the second one is retreat. So you can remain or you can retreat. Now, this is one that we don't talk about a lot, but sometimes it's time to cut bait and move on to something else. And like I said, sometimes even though it's not talked about a lot, it's a necessary thing to do, because if God is not in it, and he hadn't called you to it, then you need to get out of it. And the Israelites also learned this the hard way on a couple of occasions. There was one time in Scripture where God told them to go attack certain people, and they didn't do it because they were scared. So then they come back, and God was mad at them, and they didn't understand why they didn't do it. So then they said, hey, we're going to go do it now, even though we shouldn't. And they went and did it, and they got their teeth kicked in, and they knew God wasn't in it, so they retreated, had multiple losses that day. And I think it's just the reminder, like, hey, if God's not in something, we don't want to be involved in it. And I know sometimes, we can get caught up in certain things, and it's like, hey, we're doing something necessarily that God hasn't called us to, so we want to be able to move on to something else, and it's hard to discern. That's why this requires wisdom, because you don't want to retreat when you need to remain. You don't want to remain when you need to retreat, so it takes staying close to God and understanding that. And the third one, and then we'll kind of discuss a little bit, is rise up. This is one of my favorites because in the face of adversity and pain and against all odds, God may be calling you to step up to the plate and rise to the occasion of what God's called you to do, trusting His strength to get the job done, because if God calls us to fight, we should fight, and His strength will fight for us, and He'll fight with us, and this requires great courage. One of the verses that I like to talk about on this one is Ephesians 6:10. Very simple verse, but it says, finally, be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Because when we rise up, we have to come to the conclusion that, hey, it's in God's strength that we're fighting. It's in God's strength that we're doing this. And if God's called us to it, we can have courage. I think about the Israelites again as they were going to take the promised land and the courage that it required, and God appearing to Joshua, telling him, hey, take courage, and telling them what they were going to do. So this just requires a courage. It requires a fight. And so I think it's those three things when we come up against a situation where we can remain, we can retreat, we can rise up. And how do you know which one to do? And staying close to God. And so there's been situations in my life where I've needed to remain, where I've needed to retreat, where I've needed to rise up. And discerning those has been key. So, Austin, you got any thoughts on that? Any situations you've been in where you've had to do one of those three?
Yeah. I'll start with rise up. And this is just me, it has to do with me in ministry. And the time that kind of sticks out in my mind of when I really needed to rise up was when I was called into ministry for the first time, when I was in college, and I was in my junior year and kind of searching and praying and trying to figure out what I needed to do. But everything kept coming back to sports and ministry. And if you know anything about, FCA or ministry in general, it's tough. And it takes a lot of dedication, a lot of work on the front end, whatever it is that you're doing or when you're first coming into ministry. But had a lot of doubt that kept creeping in. A lot of people around me asking me if, is this really what you're supposed to be doing? Because financially going into it, ministry it can be tough starting out. And, I knew that's exactly what I was called to do. I knew that that was God's plan for my life, and I knew that I couldn't deny that. So I had to rise up and trust in Him to carry me through this, and as I started out in ministry, and He did just that. So that's the time that kind of sticks out, when I had to rise up and then remain. One thing that sticks out is in ministry, there comes a lot of time after you've been doing it for a while. This is year 7 for me, but there's always times that, where you just become burnt out with ministry and with dealing with people and emotions and everything that comes along with ministry. And so there's a couple different times where I've had to just remain. And a couple of the verses that kind of stick out to me and that I've reflected back on one of them's 2 Timothy 1:7. It says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but the power, the love, and the self-discipline." And with that verse, that self-discipline part has always stuck out to me, because in ministry, times you've felt alone, felt frustrated with whatever, that self-discipline has got to kick in for you. And the self-discipline to remain in the Word, to remain in prayer, to remain in just chasing after what God's got for you next in ministry. And so that's one verse that's stuck out. And then the next one's Joshua 1:9 that a lot of people probably know, but it reads, "This is my command, be strong and courageous, do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." And discouragement is real in ministry. I can think of a lot of times, and Lincoln, you've been a part of some of these times where we've showed up to do ministry and we were the only two that showed up.
Yep.
And so that will bring immediate discouragement to you when you're doing ministry, when you're pouring in, everything that you've got into something that you're so passionate about, and then others just don't show up just because they don't care, or that's not a priority for them. So that's another time where you've got to remain focused, and we saw a lot of fruit come from situations like that, and continue to do so in our ministries. But yeah, ministry's hard, and remaining in it is tough because there's so many distractions, and Satan's always putting thoughts in your head, people in your path to discourage you from that, because he's trying to obviously get us away from sharing the gospel.
No, that's very true. I think that's key in ministry, and a lot of tough situations, just being able to remain and do that and keep doing what God's called us to do. And I know for me, when I was transitioning from FCA to do what I do now full time, I knew God had called me to it, but I knew it wasn't time yet. And the word I kept getting from him was to remain where I was. And I think that sometimes you might be in a season where God has called you to a new season, but that time for that new season's not here yet. So what he does in those situations is he calls us to remain, bloom where we're planted, do the best where we can, where he's called us to. And as Austin talked about, fighting that spirit of fear with the power of the Lord, being courageous in him and doing what God's called us to do. So as we close out, just remember those three things as you come across situations in your life that may be difficult, or something may be going on, you can't understand it. Say, do I remain? Keep doing what I've been doing because that's what I should be doing. Do I retreat? Is this a situation that, God's not in it, and this is a situation I need to cut bait and move on? Or rise up, like, I need to take it to a new level, like really rest in God's strength, really do what God's called me to do, consecrate myself before the Lord and fight this battle in the Lord's strength. And remember, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. So when all else fails, continue to pound, continue to do what God's called you to do, and continue to stay close to him in his word and his spirit around other believers, discerning whether you should remain, retreat, or rise up. So thank you for joining us today. This has been the Sunday 15 edition of the His Show podcast, and we will see you next time.